Hello and welcome to another episode of Left to It All. I am your host, C.M. Phillips. This is a show that tries to cover and understand issues that affect us all: healthcare, housing, workers' rights, foreign and domestic policy, human rights, and economics, all through a very critical lens of class analysis. Today, I will be continuing with part 3 on propaganda. I'm almost certain there will be, at the very least, a part 4 in this series. The ammunition factory churning out disinformation is so prolific that I'm barely able to keep up. I'm probably going to have to break up the episodes by creating videos on other topics in between to prevent the propaganda series from becoming too monotonous. Today's episode is a new development in the U.S. manipulation machine. Well, not really new in terms of how the propaganda model works, but in how brazen those who lie for a living do so more and more openly. Mixed in with the same lies used in the past, those in power and the ruling elite can get away with pretty much anything they want. All the while ripping off U.S. taxpayers over things they don't want, like endless war, over things they actually need, like healthcare, good quality jobs, and some financial security. The lies of politicians, governments, and corporations have always been suppressed from the masses to at least some degree. Over decades of indoctrination, those in power have been able to tell the public bold-faced lies with less and less criticism by the press, with near impunity. As we went over in episodes 1 and 2, we learned that huge corporations have used different techniques to manage the masses' opinions through a constant campaign using distraction and omission of important facts to distort the truth. If the working class were to be well-informed part of society, they might start seeing beyond petty differences of race and gender, sexual orientation, faith, or the nationality of their fellow workers. They might just realize this form of politics is only used to divide, and discover the reality of the bitter class war that is being waged on us all of the time. When billionaires are shooting themselves into outer space for a few minutes just for kicks, while the majority of us struggle to make rent, have newborn babies, and can't find baby formula or even pay their bills, all the while going deeper and deeper into debt, something is very wrong with the system. And I think we all know it. First off, I want to cover the short-lived rise and fall of the Disinformation Governance Board, because honestly, it's just funny. On April 27, 2022, the Biden administration announced the creation of the Disinformation Governance Board, working as an extension of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, along with other affiliated agencies such as the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, because they've done a great job in the past, by the way, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Office of Intelligence and Analysis, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Infrastructure Security Agency, the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, the Privacy Office, I don't even know it, and the Science and Technology Directorate. Hilariously, 3 weeks later, on May 18th, the board's operations were paused as a result of public backlash, and the board's head, Nina Jankowicz, resigned. According to the new White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. The board had to pause because of the mischaracterization of the board. But the work continues. Kind of sounds like a threat. So the Disinformation Governance Board, tasked with fighting against disinformation, was itself taken down by disinformation? Clearly, from the start, this was a genius idea. That said, pausing it doesn't mean the board has been dissolved. Even if it is, chances are they will just change its name and their media approach to garner better support down the road. So let's talk about this paused board that lasted 3 weeks. Published on May 2nd on the DHS website titled Fact Sheets, it reads, "The U.S. Department of Homeland Security is charged with safeguarding the United States against threat to its security, including threats exacerbated by disinformation. More accurately, information that is not controlled by the narrative approved by the ruling elite." Let's get that one clear. Continuing, disinformation, which is false information that is deliberately spread with the intent to deceive or mislead, can take many forms. When it comes to DHS's work, the department is focused on disinformation that threatens the security of the American people, including disinformation spread by foreign states such as Russia, China, Iran, or other adversaries, such as transnational criminal organizations and human smuggling organizations. Just to throw that one in. Such malicious actors often spread disinformation to exploit vulnerable individuals and the American public, including during national emergencies. So, as discussed in my earlier episodes in the propaganda series, we found that all information given to the masses is filtered through various institutions, think tanks, research groups, government agencies, corporations, media, and entertainment, to either dilute the message or completely distort the facts. I'll pick up on think tanks in the near future. If you do not have a well-informed electorate, you don't have a functioning democracy. This is where the term democracies die in darkness comes from. Quote, "The department identifies disinformation that threatens the homeland through publicly available sources. So, research conducted by academic and other institutions and information shared by other federal agencies and partners." I'm literally quoting this. DHS then shares factual information related to its mission to potentially impacted people in organizations. So, the Disinformation Governance Board cleans up any leaks from other agencies and censors research conducted by academic and other institutions. It continues. The department is deeply committed to doing all of its work in a way that protects Americans' freedom of speech, civil rights, civil liberties, and privacy. Coming from the Homeland Security, that's kind of funny. In fact, the Disinformation Governance Board is an internal working group that was established with the explicit goal of ensuring these protections are appropriately incorporated across the Department of Homeland Security's disinformation-related work, and that rigorous safeguards are in place. The working group also seeks to coordinate the department's engagements on this subject with other federal agencies and a diverse range of external stakeholders. Okay, so to reassure us, they write, the working group does not have any operational authority or capability. All that they are saying here is that the board itself has no operational authority. However, it works inside the Department of Homeland Security, so the board itself won't be crashing through my windows in the middle of the night with guns aimed at my head for doing part of a show about them. That will be another agency altogether. I'm glad they pointed that out. I know I feel better. And finally, the term they used, external stakeholders, sounds strangely ominous, but what does it mean exactly? I can only speculate here, but I'm guessing outside institutions of the ruling elite, it's impossible to be certain with a term that vague, but I suppose that's the point. Many people have already compared the DGB, the Department of the Disinformation Governance Bureau. I like just calling it the DGB at this point because it's such a long and aggravating name. Many people have already compared the DGB to George Orwell's book 1984, a synopsis from Wikipedia. A story takes place in an imagined future in the year 1984, when much of the world has fallen victim to perpetual war, omnipresent government surveillance, historical negatism, historical denialism, and propaganda. Wait, oh, that sounds oddly familiar. Right. So, the totalitarian superstate Oceania, ruled by the party who employ the thought police to persecute individuality and independent thinking. Big Brother, the dictatorial leader of Oceania, enjoys an intense cult of personality, manufactured by the party's excessive brainwashing techniques. The protagonist, Winston Smith, is a diligent and skillful rank and file worker at the Ministry of Truth. An out-of-party member who secretly hates the party and dreams of rebellion, he expresses his dissent by writing in a diary and later enters into a forbidden relationship with his colleague Julia and starts to remember what life was like before the party came to power. Orwell modeled his fictional totalitarian government after Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany. He wrote the work as a warning of the consequences of totalitarianism, mass surveillance, and repressive regimentation of people and behaviors within society. All right. So, who was leading this newly defunct Ministry of Truth? Journalist John Kiriakou, former CIA analyst and senior investigator for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, wrote an article for Mint Press News. Quote, Nina Jankowicz, as the Disinformation Governance Board's chairman. She is the hyper-partisan author of 2 books, How to Be a Woman Online, Surviving Abuse and Harassment, and How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News, and the Future of Conflict. A former Fulbright Clinton scholar who oversaw programs for Russia and Belarus for the National Democratic Institute, which is a cutout of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a cutout of the CIA. Just, he didn't mention that, but it's relevant. Continuing on Jankowicz, he writes, she has also courted controversy with her social media posts, saying previously that the Hunter Biden laptop was a Trump campaign product. This was patently false and was, in fact, disinformation promoted by the Democratic National Committee. We've already went over that. She also endorsed a podcast appearance of Christopher Steele, the discredited author of the so-called Steele dossier, alleging Russian collusion with the Trump campaign. Okay, so this is me. Back to me again, real quick. Just a reminder, there has been zero evidence for Russiagate. I suppose if you repeat a lie enough, the lie becomes truth. Russiagate appears to be a little more than Trump wanting to build a Trump Tower in Moscow, and that was before he was even president. I think Trump is an ass, but let's face facts. There are far more legitimate acts of collusion on a far greater scale by presidents and politicians. So, Kariakou continues. In commenting about Elon Musk's recent purchase of Twitter, she said, "I shudder to think about if free speech absolutists, free speech absolutists were taking over more platforms, what that would be like for the marginalized communities around the world, which are already shouldering so much abuse, disproportionate amounts of abuse. So disinformation doesn't count when it matches your own political agenda, while free speech is actually a bad thing." John Kariakou's awesome. Honestly, I feel bad for the for the Department of Homeland Security, a government agency that is basically tasked with the job of spying on every American citizen through the Patriot Act. Almost lost someone as talented as Nina Jankowicz. This was a person who could sing about disinformation, rewording the lyrics to Mary Poppins' famous song Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious in such a cringe-worthy way that just thinking about it makes me want to pour hydrofluoric acid straight down my ear canal. I'm sure many people have seen the video. If you haven't watched it, I don't recommend it. Seriously. However, for any masochists who may be watching, who get off on self-torture, I will put a link in the description below. I personally recommend a strong drink for afterwards. I know I needed one. Okay, so moving on from Nina Jankowicz and her amazing karaoke skills, Kariakous writes, "I also don't think the Disinformation Governance Board, is the most immediate threat to our freedom of speech. That comes from purportedly private companies that take government money, name former government bigwigs to their boards, and then feign independence, crack down on alternative media that don't tout the government narrative. I'm talking about a dangerous new organization called NewsGuard. NewsGuard, a private company created and run by Stephen Brill and L. Gordon Krovitz. Hopefully I'm saying his name right, I'm not sure. These men have fine journalistic credentials. But that's not where my complaint lies," says Kariakous. "My complaint is that NewsGuard issues what is called trust ratings for news. It offers something called misinformation fingerprints to tell you when you are consuming what the company has determined to be disinformation. They market this as a journalistic solution to online misinformation. And they claim partnerships with the Departments of State and Defense, Microsoft, Apple, and other tech giants, although the nature of those partnerships is not clear. We do know, however, that the Pentagon last year gave NewsGuard $750,000 for access to its Disinformation Fingerprints project. which it described in the contract as a catalog of known hoaxes, lies, and disinformation stories spreading online. A score of 60 points or more gives a site a green label, but a score below 60 points gives the site a dreaded red label. Michael Hayden, the name should ring a bell. Whatever. Hayden is a retired four-star general who was the director of the National Security Agency, NSA, on September 11, 2001. He was the guy who immediately implemented a massive program of warrantless wiretapping of American citizens, all in the name of national security. Hayden later became director of the CIA, where he oversaw the agency's illegal, immoral, and unethical torture, kidnapping, and secret prison programs. He's also a former principal deputy director of national intelligence, and if he hasn't already done enough damage to the country, more recently Hayden was a signatory on an open letter full of disinformation and outright lies that indicated the Hunter Biden laptop, here we go again, was a Russian intelligence operation. That was laughable even before Hunter Biden stated publicly that the laptop was his. It was his. Another one of NewsGuard's advisors is former Secretary of Homeland Security, DHS, Tom Ridge. It was Ridge who implemented the notorious Patriot Act in 2001 and the Homeland Security Act of 2002, which severely restricted American civil liberties. Those restrictions last to this day. It was also Ridge who was the subject of a lawsuit in 2004 created by Canadian national Meher Arar. I know I'm screwing up his name. Sorry, Meher, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. And I know I looked it up, but I can't remember. Arar was a university professor in Toronto who had gone on vacation to Tunisia in 2002. On his way back to Toronto, while changing planes in New York, he was snatched up by FBI agents at the request of the CIA. And with the cooperation of the DHS agents and sent to Syria, he was tortured mercilessly. Hold on. Let me try that one again. He was tortured mercilessly for 10 months. Jesus Christ, I didn't mean to make a joke about torture. The U.S. maintained that he had connections to Al-Qaeda, allegations that were never proven. The Syrians finally informed the U.S. that despite the fact that Arar had been forced to sign a confession, he had no information about Al-Qaeda. He was simply the wrong guy. Arar was released and returned to Toronto. Nothing ever came of his suit against Tom Ridge and others. Ridge cited national security to have it dismissed. It just keeps getting better. Another of NewsGuard's eminent advisors is Anders Rasmussen. I'm pretty certain I'm getting that name wrong too. The former Prime Minister of Denmark and the former Secretary General of NATO. This is going to be important sooner or later down the road. It was Rasmussen who sent Danish troops into Iraq to look for weapons of mass destruction that never existed. And as the leader of NATO, it was Rasmussen who oversaw NATO's wars in Afghanistan and Libya. In 2014, this champion of transparency and opponent of disinformation told the Chatham House think tank, "I have met allies who can report that Russia, as part of their sophisticated information and disinformation operations, engaged actively with so-called non-governmental organizations, environmental organizations, working against shale gas to maintain European dependence on imported Russian gas. Yes, he actually said, with no evidence or proof whatsoever, that environmentalists who oppose fracking only because Russians have tricked them into it. Karyaku continues, NewsGuard have recently launched a battle against independent news sites like Consortium News, Antiwar.com, The Gray Zone, and Mint Press News. Why? Because these independent media outlets actually have journalists who do actual journalism. Instead of just writing the approved narrative. Unlike mainstream media that just regurgitates government disinformation, like the so-called journalists at CNN, MSNBC, the Associated Press, and so on. What a real journalist, Ben Norton, of Multipolarista, calls government stenographers. That's all they are. They don't report anything except for what this narrative is. That's it. Report the narrative that's approved of by the elite. He continues, Gray Zone founder Max Blumenthal recently said on the Jimmy Dore show that he wears NewsGuard's red label as a badge of honor. As bad as all this is, NewsGuard and the government's silly Disinformation Governance Board aren't the only problems that independent journalism sites are currently facing. PayPal last week cancels Consortium News account, at least temporarily seized its funds. It finally released the funds after 3 days, but said the account itself would be suspended permanently. PayPal gave no warning or reason for the action, and there was no due process or appeal. PayPal took the action on the first day of Consortium News' biannual fundraising drive. Mint Press News' PayPal account was also suspended. Consortium News is one of the country's most highly respected independent news sources. Karyaku writes, it was founded in 1995 by journalist Robert Parry, who gained fame at the Associated Press and later at Newsweek for his role in uncovering the Iran-Contra affair and for breaking the story of CIA involvement in Contra cocaine trafficking. Parry was the winner of a prestigious George Polk Award for National Reporting and of the I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence, bestowed by Harvard University's Nieman Foundation. Oh, man. This, in short, is called censorship. Either we have freedom of speech or we don't. No, I am not saying that it's okay to yell fire in a crowded auditorium unless there's actually a fire. Nor am I advocating for speech that incites violence. Yes, certain elements of speech need to be limited in order to protect people from getting hurt. What should be common sense? However, these institutions are using propaganda and censorship as a way of controlling people's understanding of the reality in which they live. Right now, the mainstream media are using the propaganda model to misinform us about what is happening in Ukraine. I know I'm going to get shit about this one, but the next episode is going to be all about it. So Buckle up. As if one day Russian President Vladimir Putin woke up and said, today would be a beautiful day to invade Ukraine. The sun's out, the birds are singing, why not? There is a historical narrative here. And that history, vital to people's understanding of the invasion, is being attacked and ignored by the mainstream media. Yes, the Russian invasion is an act of aggression and a violation of international law. I condemn it. I am anti-war. I am anti-imperialist. But without context, we do not understand the full history that leads up to this point. I will be covering this in detail on the next show, so I'll stop here. Censorship is a means of taking away our rights as citizens and is corrosive to democracy itself. It is used to stifle human nature, our inquisitiveness, creativity, independent thought. Right now, education, independent news media, and other platforms are under attack. Please notice this is a bipartisan effort. Both Republicans and Democrats contribute. Whether it's by taking away certain literature and other educational materials out of school settings or canceling entire news programs like Russia Today, RT America, and Sputnik, it takes away information that may give people a different perspective. Even if you don't agree with an opinion or an idea, don't you still deserve the right to hear it? To decide that for yourself? This has been done in the past. This is not new by any means, and is often done in the name of national security or patriotism, to obfuscate the truth about everything from the economy to war. This is incredibly dangerous, not just for our own societies and countries, but for the world at large. We often think of authoritarian regimes in other countries suppressing information, cracking down on free speech, and dissent. But this is exactly what is happening right here in the United States, a country where journalists and whistleblowers are either run out of the country or imprisoned, sometimes both. Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, is the most infamous example of the extreme lengths our government will go to crush any form of journalism that goes directly against its planned narrative. Assange, an Australian-born editor, publisher, and activist, published a series of leaks in 2010, including the Baghdad airstrike collateral murder video, the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, and Cablegate, provided by U.S. Army intelligence analyst and whistleblower Chelsea Manning, documenting the numerous war crimes committed by the United States. In a 2021 interview with exberliner.com, Daniel Ellsberg, the famous whistleblower of the Pentagon Papers over the Vietnam War, said, "I am in favor of all the whistleblowers who are put on trial. Now, Julian is in a different class because he is a publisher, like the New York Times or The Guardian. In that sense, his indictment is even more sinister because it strikes directly at press freedom and the First Amendment, which in the U.S. protects freedom of speech and the press. To be clear, the prosecution of sources like me is already very questionable under the First Amendment. Major league scholars argued at the time that it was unconstitutional to use against a former official like myself. They argued that freedom of the press and freedom of speech should assure protection of my statements. However, that hasn't been upheld under any court since my prosecution, and about a dozen such defendants have been convicted or actually made guilty guilty plea bargains because of the risk of longer imprisonment than that they faced. The Supreme Court has, however, addressed the unconstitutionality of going after the press itself, which, after all, is the only non-government profession mentioned in the Constitutional Bill of Rights. This isn't because the press are wonderful people, but because they serve a role which is absolutely vital to a republic and to any country that aspires to be a self-governing democracy. They provide the information that the public needs if they are to be sovereign. So they are protected. And obviously, Julian Assange should be protected. But for reasons that I can't truthfully fathom, a number of journalists disclaim that he is a journalist. I don't know what they hope to achieve by making a point like that. Ex-Berliner, this sounds very cynical and also very short-sighted. Wouldn't the prosecution of Julian Assange create a dangerous precedent for investigative journalism as a whole? Ellsberg responds, yes, I think it's very short-sighted of them. Because once this precedent is decided in the United States, it will not only apply to American journalists. This very case is about an Australian and Ecuadorian outside the U.S. If Assange is extradited with the help of the British and faces prosecution in the U.S., then no journalist in the world is safe from life imprisonment in the United States. The extradition would potentially mean that journalists anywhere in the world could be extradited to other countries for exposing classified information of those countries. Yet the possibility of democracy in the world depends on the public's ability to get information through investigative journalism and through leaks. Assange has been confined to Belmarsh Maximum Security Prison in London since April 2019. His extradition to the United States charged under the 1917 Espionage Act would carry a maximum sentence of 175 years in prison for committing the crime of investigative journalism. Assange would essentially die in prison. Democracies die in darkness because masses are not shown the light. They are not even aware of it. The sun is blocked out of the sky by those in power. The people run around in a maze, blind to the world in which they live, uninformed and overwhelmed. This is by design. Thank you for watching.